All right, hello everyone. Welcome to section 5. This module is about the legal foundations of Homeland Security. All right, so like any other kind of criminal justice policy, Homeland Security policy, law enforcement policies, uh, all those policies and procedures have to be based on some kind of legal foundation, right? They can't just go do whatever they want. There's statutes, the Constitution, um, all those things that play a role in developing criminal justice or Homeland Security policy. So they should be based, first of all, on the constitutional authority, and then the various statutes underneath that, which all should in turn adhere to the Constitution. So when you're thinking about these legal foundations of Homeland Security, you have to think about there's two different kinds of legal foundations. You have domestic considerations, and then you also have international considerations. So domestically, law and policy, uh, the people that make that have to try to find this balance between the need for counterterrorist legislation, which I think we can all agree is a need, while also protecting the constitutional rights of American citizens. International legal foundations are quite a bit different um, in that the Constitution really isn't a consideration necessarily when you're talking about things going on overseas. And these are more based on tradition, custom, and formal agreements between nations. Um, Whether that be just an agreement or a treaty, something along those lines. But when you're talking about international counterterrorist policy, oftentimes the agreements and the enforcement of those agreements, oftentimes it's very voluntary. Like countries agree to do these things, but there really aren't repercussions for not adhering to the agreement. There really there's not really much in the way of an enforcement mechanism on those kind of international agreements. And if you kind of look back on, in the first reading this week, really kind of outlines this. But you can look back through the history of the various conventions and statutes, and you can really kind of trace this progression, the evolution of Homeland Security policy and law, and it also gives you really good insight into what the main issues were and what was most important during the different periods of time when the various, be they statutes or conventions or treaties, whatever they are, whatever they were enacted, it really kind of gives you an insight into what people were focused on at that time. So this week there's several readings. Some of them are simply acts, like some of them, like the Patriot Act, are simply that. I'm not really going to spend any time here going through each of the actual laws and statutes, that are posted, but please browse through them. Some of them are pretty intense, lots of pages, but please go through them and kind of read through them when you have a chance. The Martin chapter does a good job of kind of outlining the various international conventions and domestic statutes that outline current Homeland Security policy. And because it really is just kind of a discussion of the various items, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on Martin, but there is a lot of good, important information in there, especially if you aren't very familiar with the types of international conventions, domestic acts, statutes. It really does a good job of kind of laying all that out and what the various things do. All right, so the first article I'm going to discuss is Suarez. Suarez does a really nice job of describing the progression of the legal doctrines that outlined the surveillance capability of the United States. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time going through this progression, but because Suarez does a really good job at that. And any discussion I would have would mostly just kind of be a rehashing of whatever he wrote. So we're going to focus on part 4, which is where do we go from here? So one of the important points that Suarez makes in that section is that because of this kind of borderless nature of the internet and telecommunications, any statutes that are passed in the U.S. also will affect those in other allied countries, and kind of vice versa, right? Anything they pass will also impact us. So in the past, everyone regarded combating terrorism as this global initiative that required cooperation and coordination from kind of everybody around the globe. And even though that was the way it was always kind of conceived, the ways in which that happened were much more concrete, right? Because we didn't have the internet, you didn't have this kind of nebulous, like no borders kind of stuff going on. So this new technology regarding the internet and other wireless communications has really changed the game regarding um, international cooperation and as far as forming policy. Um, when you're talking about things that are being transmitted over the internet or these new wireless telecommunications. Another important point made by Suarez is that counterterrorism policy and legislation will continue to be challenged regarding its constitutionality. Um, and this has always been an issue, and it's going to always be an issue um, because the constitutionality of things has always got to be considered when creating policy. There's no reason to create policy or legislation that will just be found to be unconstitutional. So this debate of security versus safety is going to continue. It's always going to continue to be discussed. Some legislators will continue to introduce bills or amendments that try to curtail powers, while others will continue to introduce bills that will expand those powers. So this debate about what can and cannot be done is going to be an ongoing thing. So really kind of think about not only this concept of these kind of borderless kind of issues with the internet, but also how does that relate to the Constitution? How does it relate to powers as far as surveillance, American citizens versus international? So really kind of think about that when you're reading through Suarez. Suarez also goes into and makes it important point that's actually currently being discussed in present day. How much responsibility do social media companies have for shutting down extremism and terrorism related posts on their forums? What responsibility do they have for reporting those things to the FBI? Can the government regulate what is on social media sites? So how much responsibility do they actually have for what is put on those sites? And then how does the government interact with them as well? And who's making the decision? Another thing to think about is who's making the decision as far as what is extremism and what is terrorism. Obviously, some things are obviously those, right? But other things are not. So who's making those decisions about, if they are shutting things down, who's making the decisions about what is and what is not extremism, or what is not included there? This goes back to that whole conversation about definitions that we've had. What definition are these social media companies using for making those determinations? All right, so that's Suarez. All right, so in the last article for this week is Hook, Peterlin, and Welsh. They discuss information sharing between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So they spend a large portion of their article discussing the various types of oversight related to intelligence collection and information sharing. And the discussions in the article are related to the Patriot Act specifically, but it's a really good discussion of the types of oversight kind of more generally as well. When you're thinking about oversight, and when these kind of discussions kind of get out into the main and kind of out into the public, there's kind of these two main camps that make the most noise. You have the one camp that says lots of oversight will make intelligence collection and addressing threats too time-consuming to be useful, and is unnecessary because agencies can really be trusted to adhere to the Constitution and all applicable laws. The other camp is essentially that there can never be too much oversight, and that any negative complications from or implications from oversight are really worth it to ensure that everything is done legally and rights are protected. So you kind of have these two kind of main camps. So how much is really needed? Well, it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like most things in policy, most things in life, really, right? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle of those things. Should there be oversight of surveillance and intelligence collection techniques? I think we all could agree that there should be, right? But the big question then is how much? What is an adequate amount of oversight. Is judicial oversight enough? Congressional oversight enough? Some combination of congressional and judicial? What about the sunset provisions? Are these necessary, or are they absolutely necessary? Right? Um, is there validity to this argument that bureaucracies may not change their operations for provisions that may just expire? Um, is that a valid argument? Um, does having these sunset provisions kind of eliminate the need for these other types of oversight? The fact that things have an endpoint and then would have to be renewed, does that kind of take away from this need for these other types of oversight? And or does that just mean that there is this kind of oversight there at the end when it had to be renewed? The entire U.S. government was set up under this umbrella of checks and balances. So having checks and balances throughout the system is most likely a good thing, and that's how the founders kind of envisioned the government is having these constant checks and balances to make sure that nobody has more power really than anybody else. So this article really raises some really good points concerning how much oversight is really necessary, or what kind of oversight should be necessary as far as intelligence collection and information sharing. So again, even though it's specific to the Patriot Act, it raises a lot of important issues regarding surveillance and oversight that are going to continue to be issues going forward. As long as there's someone collecting information about somebody, this is going to be an ongoing issue. So really kind of think about these kinds of oversight and are they even effective? Like, are these even effective types of oversight, or does there need to be something else that we do? And finally, I think the statement that they make kind of at the end is that the problem is not that law enforcement intelligence agencies are sharing information, as long as that information was acquired legally in the first place. And I think that is a really important point that they make, because people make this argument about, well, should they even be sharing information anyway? But I think the bigger issue then is not necessarily that they're sharing this information, but is the information being acquired legally in the first place? All right, so with that, I'm going to stop for this week. Be sure to complete your assignments, and I'll see you next week. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know.